The knock came at the worst hour, when the cold had already won and the fire in the stove had dropped to a low orange breathing thing that gave more memory of heat than heat itself. Daniel Voss stood in the dark of his kitchen, with his daughter's blanket over his shoulders, and listened to the wind throw sleet against the glass. He had $13 in a coffee can and 4 pieces of split oak left in the rack by the door. The knock came again, slow and heavy, a fist that did not belong to anyone small. He crossed the cold linoleum in his socks and opened the door to 3 men whose breath rolled white off their faces, leather creaking, snow melting in their beards, and behind them at the edge of the porch light a row of motorcycles tilted under a hard sky. He should have been afraid. Any sane man on that ridge that night should have been afraid. The lead man stood a full head over Daniel's shoulders that filled the doorframe, a beard gone iron gray and frosted at the edges, and his eyes moved past Daniel into the warmth of the house with the quick red of someone who had spent a life measuring rooms before he entered them. But Daniel was not afraid in the way the night wanted him to be. He was too tired to be afraid. He had buried that kind of fear a long time ago in a smaller box, beside other things he no longer let himself want. Engines froze, the big man said. His voice came out low and grinding, the sound of gravel under a slow tire. 3 of us. We've been on that highway since Tilden. Can't feel my hands. Behind him, the wind made the only other sound, and the sleet, and far down the slope, the tick of cooling metal. Daniel looked at the 3 of them, at the snow caked into the treads of their boots, at the youngest one, whose lips had gone a bad color, and he did the arithmetic that poor men learn to do fast. 4 pieces of oak, $13. A girl asleep down the hall who would wake at 6 and need the stove lit and breakfast warm, and 3 strangers on his porch who would not last the walk back down to the county road. He opened the door the rest of the way. "Come in before you let all the heat out," he said, as if there were heat to let out at all. That was the decision. It did not feel like courage to him. Courage is a word people use afterward, when they are safe and the story is finished, and they need a clean shape to put around the thing that happened. Quote, "In the moment it felt only like the obvious thing, the human thing, the thing his own father would have done back when they still had a father and a farm and a different life." He stepped aside, and 3 of the most dangerous-looking men he had ever seen walked into his kitchen and stood dripping on his floor while the wind slammed the door shut behind them. His name was Daniel Voss, and he was 38 years old, and he lived at the end of a gravel spur off Hollow Creek Road in a house his grandfather had framed by hand in 1961. The house had been good once. The house had been a place with a deep porch and a stone chimney and a barn that smelled of cut hay. Now half the barn roof was open to the weather, and the porch sagged at the east corner where the joists had rotted, and the whole structure had the lean of a thing that had stopped being maintained and started being merely survived in. He had been surviving in it for 2 years, since the layoff at the mill, since the divorce that followed the layoff the way one bad season follows another. Since the morning his wife took the better car and left him the house and the girl and the debt. The girl was the only thing that had kept him standing. Her name was Sophie, and she was 7. And she slept under 3 quilts in the back bedroom with a nightlight shaped like a paper moon, and every single decision Daniel made ran through her first. The $13 in the coffee can was for milk and bread. The 4 pieces of oak were the difference between her waking warm and her waking cold. He had been splitting the last of the dead elm by headlamp for a week, stretching it, burning it green when he had to, watching the woodpile shrink toward nothing while the forecast stacked one freezing night on top of the next. So, when he fed those 3 men his last firewood, he understood exactly what he was spending. He was not a saint, and he did not pretend the cost away. He crouched at the open stove door and laid the 4 pieces of oak in one at a time, settling each into the coals with the iron poker, and he watched the dry wood catch and the flames climb and the heat begin to push back the cold that had owned the kitchen. The strangers held their hands out to it without being told. Tuck got down close, almost too close, the bad color in his lips slow to retreat. Daniel watched the warmth reach them, and somewhere under his ribs, a small, cold voice did the math and told him what tomorrow would look like. 4 gone, none left. A girl who woke at 6. He told the voice to be quiet. He put the kettle on the back burner of a stove that had not seen a full pot of coffee in a month. He measured the grounds by feel, scraping the bottom of the tin, getting maybe 3 weak cups out of what should have been 1. And he set the chipped mugs on the table without ceremony and did not tell anyone it was the last of anything. Tuck wrapped both hands around his mug and shivered so hard the coffee trembled. Marsh held his and did not drink, only watched the room over the rim, and Daniel felt the lean man's eyes move across the duct-taped window, the single bag of rice, the empty rack by the door, taking inventory the way some men cannot help doing. Cole Renner drank his in 2 long pulls and set the mug down soundless, and said nothing at all. And the quiet that settled over the table was not comfortable and not threatening. Just the quiet of 4 tired men and 1 fire doing the only thing it could. The big man's name was Cole Renner, though Daniel did not learn it. That night the others called him Prez, short and clipped, the way men say a thing. They have said 10,000 times. The young one with the bad lips was barely 20 and went by Tuck, and he sat closest to the stove and could not stop shivering for the better part of an hour. The third was lean and silent and watchful, with a long scar running pale through one eyebrow and eyes that did not miss the rotted corner of the ceiling or the duct tape on the window or the single bag of rice on the otherwise empty shelf. They called him Marsh. He spoke twice the whole night, and both times it was a single word, and both times the others moved when he said it. They did not threaten him. That was the thing Daniel kept coming back to later, the thing that did not fit the shape the world had taught him to expect. 3 patched-out bikers, frozen and cornered, alone with a man and his sleeping child at the dead end of a road where no one would hear a thing. And they sat at his table and warmed their hands and were in their hard and quiet way careful. Tuck lowered his voice when Daniel mentioned the girl asleep down the hall. Marsh took his boots off at the door without being asked, set them neat against the wall so the melting snow would not track across the floor. Cole Renner drank the thin coffee and looked at the failing house with an expression Daniel could not read, and said almost nothing, and watched the fire eat the last of the oak down to coals. Near midnight, the storm let up enough that Tuck got the bikes turned over, one after another, the engines coughing and then catching, the sound enormous in the frozen dark. The 3 men stood on the sagging porch, pulling their gloves back on. Cole Renner paused at the top of the steps and looked back through the open door at the dim kitchen, at the empty wood rack, at the man who had given strangers the warmth he could not spare. "You burned your last wood on us," Renner said. It was not a question. The lean man, Marsh, had seen the rack and done his own arithmetic, and the truth of it sat in the air between them. Daniel shrugged inside the borrowed blanket. "You needed it more than the stove did tonight." Renner looked at him a moment longer. Something moved behind the iron-gray beard, some old machinery turning over. Then he nodded. Once the way a man nods when he has filed a thing away in a place he does not forget. And he went down the steps and threw a leg over the big black machine, and the three of them rolled down the gravel spur and were gone, taillights swallowed by the trees, a thunder of them fading, until the only sound left was the wind and the ticking stove, and a house going slowly cold around a sleeping girl. Daniel did not sleep. He sat by the dying coals on the kitchen chair with the spindleback and fed them splinters of kindling, the bark scraps off the floor, the slats of a broken crate, anything that would burn, nursing the heat toward morning so the room would not freeze around the girl down the hall. He listened to the house tick and settle in the cold. He listened to the wind find every gap his grandfather's framing had developed in 60 years and push through it by 4. The coals were gray ash, with a single orange eye left in them. He went out onto the dark porch in his socks and pried the loose board off the back step, the one that had been working free all winter, and he broke it across his knee and fed the pieces in and bought himself another hour. By 5, even that was gone. When the girl padded out at 6 in her 2 big socks, dragging the smallest quilt behind her, the kitchen was cold enough to see her breath hang in the light over the stove. Daniel had his coat on over his shirt, and a forced brightness arranged on his face, and a story ready about how the stove just needed cleaning out, how he would have it roaring again by the time she was home. She believed him because she was 7, and because she wanted to, and because a child trusts that the floor will hold. He made her toast on the last of the bread and gave her the last of the milk in her favorite cup, the one with the chipped rabbit, and he kept his own back to her at the counter so she would not see his face while she ate. He walked her down to the end of the spur to meet the school bus, her mittened hand in his bare one, and he stood in the road and watched the yellow shape labor up and swallow her and carry her away over the rise. Only then, alone in the squeaking cold, did he let his shoulders come down. He had no wood. He had no money for wood. The forecast called for 3 more nights below 0. He stood in the middle of the cold road and felt the whole weight of it settle on him the way it did most mornings now, the slow arithmetic of a life run down to its last pieces. And then he did what he always did. He went back to the house and got the chainsaw and a half tank of gas and walked into the backwoods to find something dead enough to cut, because the only thing worse than running out was lying down, and he had a girl who needed him standing. He was 3 days into that grim arithmetic when he heard them come back. It was a Saturday, late morning, the sky scrubbed a hard blue, and the cold so deep the snow squeaked underfoot. Daniel was on the barn roof with a tarp and a fistful of roofing nails, trying to close the worst of the gap before the next system rolled in, when the sound reached him from far down the valley. He knew it before he could see it. The low-rolling thunder of engines, more than 3, many more than 3, building in the still air until it filled the whole bowl of the hollow, and the icicles on the eaves seemed to tremble with it. He stopped with a nail half driven and turned on the ridge of the roof and watched the road. They came around the bend at the base of the slope in a long, disciplined column, 2 abreast, chrome throwing the sunlight in hard white bars, leather in breath, and the deep, coordinated roar of a thing that moved as one body. He counted 12, then 20, then lost the count. Behind the bikes came trucks, a flatbed stacked high with lumber under ratchet straps, a dually hauling a trailer loaded with shingle bundles in rolls of felt, a box van, a second flatbed under a blue tarp. Pratt. R. The column turned up his gravel spur, and the sound of it rose until Daniel had to brace a hand on the cold chimney to steady himself, and his first thought, the old trained thought, was that he had done something wrong, that this was the bill come due, that nothing in his life arrived in this kind of number. Then he saw Cole Renner step off the lead bike at the foot of his porch and tip his head back and look up at the man frozen on the barn roof, and the big man lifted one gloved hand, not a wave exactly, more an acknowledgement, the way one workman signals another across a job site. And Daniel understood slowly, with the disbelief of a man who had stopped expecting good things, that they had not come to take anything, they had come to give it back. He came down off the roof too fast and nearly fell and caught himself on the ladder, and by the time his boots hit the frozen ground, the yard was full of people. Bikers in cuts swung off their machines and stood looking at the failing house with the flat, assessing eyes of men who had built and broken things their whole lives. The lean one, Marsh, was already walking the foundation, crouching at the rotted east corner of the porch, running a thumb along the soft wood, looking up at the sag of the roof line, and back down, reading the whole structure the way he had read Daniel's kitchen that frozen night. Tuck, the young one, healthy now and grinning, was dropping the tailgate of the lumber truck, and Cole Renner crossed the yard to where Daniel stood and put out a hand the size of a dinner plate. "Voss," Renner said. He had learned the name. Of course, he had learned the name. "We owe you a night by your fire. We pay what we owe." Daniel took the hand because it would have been rude not to, and because his own had stopped working right, and because something in his chest had come loose, and he did not trust his voice. "You don't owe me anything," he managed. "It was 4 pieces of wood." It was the last 4 pieces of wood, Renner said, and his gray eyes did not waver. Marsh counted the rack that night. "We rode out of here, knowing what it cost you. A man gives you the last of what he's got and asks nothing. You don't forget it. That's not how we're built." He looked up at the house, at the open barn, at the tarp flapping where Daniel had tried to nail it. "You've been holding this place together with your hands, and not much else. That stops today." Daniel stood in his own yard and did not know what to do with his face. He had spent 2 years learning to need nothing and ask for nothing and accept nothing, because needing was how you got hurt, and asking was how you got told no, and accepting was how you ended up owing more than you could ever pay. The whole architecture of his survival was built on the principle that no one was coming. And here, in his frozen yard, under a hard blue sky, the engines ticking and the lumber sliding off the truck, and 20 strangers pulling tool belts from saddlebags, the architecture cracked. He turned away so the men would not see, and pretended to study the barn, and pressed the heel of his hand hard against his eyes. They worked like a thing that had done this before. That was what struck him first. Once the shock loosened enough for him to see. This was not a chaos of goodwill. This was a crew. Marsh had the whole job in his head inside an hour, and he moved through the yard, speaking little and pointing much, and the work organized itself around him. A team went up on the barn with the shingle bundles. A team tore out the rotted porch corner down to clean wood, and Daniel heard the shriek of pry bars and the wet crack of beams that should have given way under a snow load years ago. A team unloaded a generator and a compressor, and a sound rose over the hollow that Daniel had not heard on his own land in 2 years, the rattle and bang and whine of a place being built instead of a place falling down. A woman ran the box van, and out of it came food, urns of coffee, foil trays, and she set up a folding table on the only flat patch of yard and fed everyone off it through the day. Her name was Renner, too, Cole's wife, a square, sturdy woman with gray-streaked hair in a long braid. She found Daniel mid-morning standing useless at the edge of his own reconstruction, and she put a cup of coffee in his hands and a foil-wrapped breakfast sandwich on top of it, and she said, "Eat. You're no good to anybody falling over." And then quieter, looking at him with eyes that had clearly been told the story. "He's been a hard man a long time. My husband doesn't move for much. He moved for you." She squeezed his arm once and went back to the van. And Daniel ate the sandwich standing up in the cold because she had told him to. And it was the first hot meal anyone had made for him in longer than he wanted to count. Around noon, a school bus could not have timed it worse or better. The yellow shape labored up the spur and stopped at the foot of the drive, doors folding open. And Sophie came down the steps in her puffy coat with her backpack and stopped dead at the sight of her home, swarmed by leather and chrome and the roar of power tools. Daniel was across the yard before he knew he had moved, kneeling in the snow with his hands on her shoulders, watching her small face try to make sense of it. And then a remarkable thing happened. The work did not stop exactly, but it changed. The cursing dropped out of it. Tuck, up on the barn, called down something cheerful and waved a hammer. Marsh, the silent, lean man with the scarred brow, came down off the porch and crouched in front of the girl at her own level and said, in a voice Daniel had heard speak only single words, "Your dad fed us when we were freezing. You know that? Walked us right in, out of the cold. We came to fix his house." And Sophie looked from the scarred man to her father and back and asked the only question that mattered to a 7-year-old, which was whether the men with the loud bikes were nice. And Marsh said, "Today we are," and something in the dry honesty of it made the girl laugh, and the yard seemed to exhale. She spent the afternoon as a kind of mascot handed from one gentle giant to the next, given a child-sized hammer and a board to bang on well away from anything dangerous, fed cookies from the box van until Daniel had to intervene. And he watched these men the whole respectable world had taught him to cross the street to avoid, arrange their entire violent competence around the safety and delight of his daughter, and he understood that he had been told a lie somewhere along the way about where danger lived and where it didn't. By the second day, the barn had a roof, a whole roof, tight and dark and new, the gap that had been bleeding heat and weather into the structure for 2 winters sealed against the sky. The rotted porch corner was rebuilt from the joists up, new posts, new decking, the sag gone, the whole east side of the house sitting level for the first time in years. They had found the source of the cold that no amount of firewood could fix, the bare, uninsulated walls, the gaps around the windows where the duct tape had been losing a war, and they were stuffing the walls with batting and running a bead of sealant around every frame and hanging a storm door that actually shut. Tuck rebuilt the wood rack by the door, and Daniel did not understand why until the 3rd day it was not all generosity and grins. Daniel learned that on the second afternoon, when a county vehicle came up the spur and a man in a pressed jacket got out with a clipboard and a look on his face that Daniel recognized from 100 bad mornings, the look of a man who has come to tell you what you cannot do. His name was Garrett Pyle, and he was the county code enforcement officer for the district, and he announced, received a complaint about unpermitted construction at the Voss property. He stood in the rebuilt yard in his clean shoes and his pressed jacket, conspicuous as a heron in a hog lot, and he began to read from his clipboard the list of violations, the stop work order, the fines that would accrue per day, the inspections that would be required, the permits that should have been pulled. Daniel felt the old cold come back into his gut. He knew this man. Not him specifically, but his kind, the small functionary with the official weight of the county behind him, the bureaucrat who had foreclosed on the equipment loan, the clerk who had garnished the wages he no longer earned, the whole gray machinery that had ground his life down piece by piece and called it procedure. He started to apologize, started to explain, started the old grovel that poor men learn because the alternative is worse. And a heavy hand came down on his shoulder, and Cole Renner stepped past him and faced the code officer in the rebuilt yard. "There a problem?" Renner asked. His voice was perfectly level. That was the frightening part. There was no heat in it at all. Garrett Pyle had clearly not expected the bikers. He looked at the column of machines, the 20 patched men who had stopped working and turned, unhurried, to watch, and a flush climbed up his neck. But he had the county behind him, and he leaned on it the way his kind always did. "This work is unpermitted," he said, voice climbing a register. "Structural modifications, roofing, all of it requires inspection and permits. I'm issuing a stop work order effective immediately. The fines are $200 a day until the property is brought into compliance, and given the scope here, that's going to be substantial." He looked at Daniel with something close to satisfaction, the look of a man who enjoys the part of his job where he gets to watch a face fall. You should have thought about that before you let them tear into it. It was the satisfaction that undid Pyle in the end, though he did not know it yet, because Marsh had come down off the porch, and Marsh had been listening, and the lean man with the scarred brow stood at Renner's shoulder and said one of his rare, full sentences. "Pull the file, Prez. I'll bet the permits are already in." Renner did not look surprised. Daniel was the only one surprised. It came out over the next hour, in pieces in the unhurried way the club did everything. They had not ridden up here with a flatbed of lumber on a whim. Before a single board came off the truck, the club's own man, a member they called Ledger, a soft-spoken older brother who had run a contracting business for 30 years before his knees gave out, had walked into the county office on Thursday morning and pulled every permit the job required, paid the fees, filed the plans, scheduled the inspections. It was all in the system. It had been in the system before Garrett Pyle ever got his complaint. The work was not unpermitted. The work was, down to the last shingle, completely and boringly legal. Pyle's clipboard sagged in his hand. He flipped pages, looking for the gap, the missing form, the technicality he could stand on. There was none. Ledger, who had appeared from somewhere in the crew, wiping his hands on a rag, walked him through it with the patience of a man who had spent 3 decades dealing with code officers and had buried better ones than this. The permits were pulled under the property owner's name, with the owner's consent. The contractor of record was licensed and bonded. The inspections were scheduled. Everything Pyle had come to threaten was already done correctly before he arrived. And then Marsh, quiet Marsh, said the second thing, and it was the thing that turned the whole afternoon. "Who filed the complaint, Pyle?" he asked. "Because there's no neighbors up here to complain. Spur dead ends at the property. So who knew there was work happening before the trucks even got loud enough to hear from the road?" The flush on Pyle's neck went a deeper color. Daniel watched the man's eyes flick just once toward the county vehicle, and in that flick was the whole answer. Ledger said mildly that he had pulled something else from the county records while he was in there. A pattern. Properties in the district where work had been red-tagged and fined into the ground, owners who could not afford the compounding penalties, liens placed, and then, a season or two later, those same properties bought up cheap at county auction. A holding company whose registered agent shared a last name with the code enforcement officer for the district. It was the kind of thing that was perfectly invisible if no one ever pulled the threads together, and perfectly damning the moment someone did. No one raised a hand. No one raised a voice. That was not how the club worked. Daniel was learning, not against this kind of man. Cole Renner simply looked at Garrett Pyle for a long, quiet moment, and then he said in that level, grinding voice, "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to get back in your truck. You're going to drive down to that county office. And the file ledger started today is going to sit there, finished with copies in 3 other places, waiting. You leave this man alone. You leave his property alone. You go back through every red tag you wrote in this district the last 4 years, and you make it right, quiet, on your own. And nobody ever has to pull that thread the rest of the way." He let it sit. "Or you push this, and we pull it all the way in the daylight, in the records, where your name lives, your choice. But you make it today." Garrett Pyle stood in the rebuilt yard with his useless clipboard and his clean shoes, and the satisfaction was gone from his face. And what replaced it was the particular gray terror of a man who has built his small kingdom on the assumption that no one beneath him would ever have the means to look up. He had spent years being the immovable weight at the bottom of other people's worst mornings, and he had never once imagined a morning where the weight came down on him in his own currency, with his own paper. He opened his mouth and closed it. He looked at the column of silent men. He looked at Ledger's mild, unbothered face, which was somehow the most frightening face in the yard because it belonged to a man who had already won and was simply waiting for the loser to understand it. He got back in his truck. He drove down the spur. The taillights of the county vehicle disappeared into the bright, cold day, and Garrett Pyle drove out into the flat, unforgiving sunlight of the world that had always protected him and felt, for the first time, that it might not. He was never a problem at the Voss property again. And in the months that followed, quietly, with no announcement, a number of red tags in the district were lifted, and a number of liens were released, and a small holding company dissolved itself and vanished, and a county code officer took an early retirement that surprised everyone who did not know why. But that was later. That afternoon in the yard, Daniel stood among the men who had just dismantled the one institution that had ever bothered to find him at the end of his road, and he did not feel triumphant. He felt the strange vertigo of a man whose understanding of the world had just been turned over. The people he had been taught were the danger had pulled the permits, filed the plans, done it all by the book, and then used nothing but the truth patiently gathered to break a man who hid his cruelty behind the very rules he pretended to enforce. There had been no violence. There had been something worse for a man like Pyle, and better for the world. There had been daylight. The work went on for 2 more days. They insulated the whole house, working room by room, pulling off the old cracked plaster where it had to come off, and packing the bays tight with batting and sealing the gaps where the cold had been pouring in like water through a hall. They rewired the kitchen, where Marsh had pulled a cover plate on the first morning, and gone very still at the sight of the old knob and tube behind it. The cloth insulation gone brittle and powdery, one bad winter from putting the whole house up in flames with a sleeping girl inside it. Daniel had not known. That was the part that sat heaviest with him afterward. How close the danger had stood the whole time, invisible, while he worried about firewood. They put a new pump on the well, and on the second evening Daniel turned the kitchen tap, and hot water came steaming, the first hot water in that house in 14 months, and he stood with his hand under it longer than he needed to. They cleared the back acre last. A team went in with 2 saws and dropped the standing dead elm and dragged out the deadfall that had been rotting under the snow, and they bucked it into rounds and ran the splitter off the generator, till the yard smelled of 2-stroke smoke and fresh cut oak, and the clean white wounds of split wood lay stacked in long courses. Cord after cord, they filled the rebuilt rack by the door, and then they stacked the south wall of the barn, shoulder high under a tarp. More dry, seasoned wood than Daniel had owned in his entire time on that land, enough for this winter and the next, and most of the one after that. Tuck leaned on the splitter, grinning, sweat steaming off him in the cold, and told Daniel that was why he had rebuilt the rack, first thing. "A man who burns his last wood on 3 frozen strangers," Tuck said, "ought to never have to see the bottom of that rack again as long as he lives." On the last evening they did not leave the way they had come. The light was going long and gold across the snow, and the house stood square and tight and warm against the coming cold, smoke rising straight from the chimney in a still air, and the men packed their tools slowly, the way men do when a good job is ending, and nobody quite wants to be the first to call it. Cole Renner found Daniel on the new porch, the porch that did not sag, and the 2 of them stood looking out at the yard full of motorcycles and the woods going dark and the first stars coming hard and bright over the ridge. "You don't owe us," Renner said before Daniel could start. "I know how your head works now, 2 days watching you. You're already trying to figure how you'll pay this back, and the answer is you don't. That's not how it works. You did a thing for nothing, expecting nothing. So did we. That's the whole point. The day you try to square it is the day you turn it into something it isn't." He pulled something from inside his cut, a small thing, and pressed it into Daniel's hand. It was a patch, hand-stitched, the club's mark, and beneath it a single word that Daniel had to tilt toward the porch light to read. "You're not a member," Renner said. "You didn't earn that, and you wouldn't want it, but you're ours now. Anybody comes up this road, meaning you or that girl Harm, you call the number ledger left on your fridge, and you will hear us coming before you finish dialing. That's not a favor. That's just true now." Daniel closed his hand around the patch. The wind moved in the new shingled barn and made no sound of getting in because there was no getting in anymore, and that small silence where a draft used to live undid him more than anything else had. He thought of the night he opened the door. He thought of the cold math, the 4 pieces of oak, the voice under his ribs that told him what tomorrow would cost. He had spent it anyway. And the world, which had taught him for 2 hard years that giving was just a slower way of losing, had handed it all back to him 1,000 times over, and more than the house, more than the wood. It had handed him back the thing the layoff and the divorce and the gray machinery had taken, which was the simple knowledge that he was not, in fact, alone at the end of his road. They rolled out at full dark, the long column of taillights flowing down the spur and out onto Hollow Creek Road and away, the thunder of them rolling back up the valley long after the lights were gone, fading by slow degrees into the ordinary silence of a winter night. Daniel stood on his solid porch until he could not hear them at all. Then he went inside into the warm, bright kitchen, where Sophie sat at the table drawing a picture of a house with too many motorcycles parked in front of it and a row of smiling, bearded men with no faces drawn yet, only beards, because she had not gotten to the faces. The stove threw real heat now, steady and deep, the new wood catching clean. He hung the patch on the nail by the door where the borrowed blanket used to hang. He put 2 pieces of dry oak in the stove, and then, because he could, because the rack was full and the south wall was stacked, and there would be more where that came from, he put in a 3rd. The warmth came up into the room and reached his daughter's hands where she bent over her drawing, and reached his own, and Daniel Voss stood in a house his grandfather built, made whole by strangers he had warmed for one night, and felt the cold, finally, fully, leave the place. Sophie looked up from her drawing. "Are they coming back?" she asked. "If we need them," Daniel said. He sat down beside her and picked up a crayon. "But I don't think we're going to need much for a while." She considered that with the seriousness of the very young, and then went back to her drawing, and began carefully to give the bearded men their faces. Outside, the smoke rose straight and unbroken into a sky gone thick with stars, and the new wood burned, and the house held its heat the way a house is supposed to, and somewhere down the long, dark road the last faint thread of engine sound finally let go of the air, and was gone. If you have ever given away the last of what you had and been afraid it would leave you with nothing, this story was for you. Thank you for sitting by this fire with me. If it warmed something in you, leave a word below so the next person who needs it can find their way. Here, too.